Okay, in which ways are we
Entonces,
organizing
¿en qué
and
forma
kind of
vamos
building
a
solidarity
organizar?
across
¿Cómo
like borders
podemos
essentially?
organizar
And that experience was,
internacionalmente?
I would say, like it
Fue
was
una
pretty traumatic.
experiencia
Just to see
traumática,
like the ways in which indigenous
como
people
para
in
ver cómo
Palestine
los
are also treated the
indígenas de
same way
Palestina
that indigenous
le
peoples are treated
trataban
in
lo
North America,
mismo
Central America, and South
como
America, and the Caribbean, and all
en
throughout like the
todas las
diaspora.
Américas y también la
Even
diáspora.
from the point of getting to the border, like getting into
Aún
Palestine, we were
la
all
frontera era
kind of
demasiado
like,
difícil. La
not
frontera de
even we were all
Palestina
like kind of like attacked by Israeli soldiers
nos
where they took all
atacaron
of our
los
passports
soldados
and they
de
had asked us,
Israel,
what are you doing here?
quitaron
Like,
nuestros
why do you want to come into
pasaportes,
Palestine?
estaban
And then
diciendo
we
por
told
qué
them like,
quieren entrar,
we're here
por
to be in
qué
solidarity. We're
están
here to like
aquí, qué
know
van a
about like
hacer.
the indigenous peoples
Y
in
le
Palestine
habíamos
and
dicho
build
que
relations with
vamos
them.
a
And
ser
they
en
were like, well, how
solidaridad
did you
con los
get to the Middle East
palestinas.
in like period in
Y nos
general?
preguntó,
And we said, we're trying to learn, we're here to learn Arabic. And to which he responded like, why are you trying to learn that disgusting swine language? So there is a, not only is there attack on language, on culture, and like water within Palestine, but the Israeli soldiers make it very evident of trying to keep other indigenous peoples and people in general outside of Palestine to kind of like omit us from having this form of solidarity with them. And I think that's very important to talk about, where it's like Palestinians are literally being subjugated to like a different type of isolation that I have not seen. And man, what else do I want to talk about? I'm getting kind of nervous because I'm better with questions, you know, like I'm kind of better with questions. I, um, yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like if it's like a back and forth conversation, it'd be
Yeah,
better for me.
I'm gonna do like the 101 for a little bit too.
Okay,
So I just
yeah,
wanted
yeah,
you to open the
that's-
floor
yeah,
up a little
that
bit,
works.
share some, some of the speakers.
This shit-
Okay.
This shit is too-
So back to the 101 stuff. A lot of stuff to get into. Florcy did a lot of like foreshadowing. So basically, let me go back to like this. Palestine has, so Palestine in Arabic is Palestine. I originally would have greeted you by saying marhaba, like I'm not really out here trying to use like the colonizer's tongue to talk to y'all, but it is the easiest thing to translate at the moment. So basically, Palestine has a long and vast history, first documented in ancient Egyptian tablets as Peliset over 3,000 years ago. The region between the Mediterranean and the River Jordan has come to mean many different things to many different people. Throughout the ages, Palestine has been a home to dozens of cultures, kingdoms, and empires. As a result, the people who have lived there have gone through many different transformations when we think about the ways in which culture, trade, and the ways in which people move in and through space, and also the ways in which culture moves in and through space, have left their marks on a community. And so a lot of times, and I'll say this later on, but like a lot of times you'll hear this narrative that like Palestinians are just Arabs that moved from other countries without actually acknowledging the fact that actually Palestinians are people of the land, indigenous to the land, and different kinds of cultures like Arabian culture and different empires have moved through the land to kind of code it in certain ways. And so right now you find Palestine to be a space with a lot of Muslimin, but there's still a very large Christian population as well as Arab Jews. And so religion isn't really the thing we think about when we think of Palestine. It is the thing that people want us to think about when we think of Palestine. But Palestine is really an indigenous cause rooted in the people who live there, who've lived there for thousands of years, and who have been under attack in terms of culture, identity, and existence simply for occupying in a specific space that other people find lucrative in certain ways. So in that respect, we have evidence of Palestine, what exists currently as Palestine, having existed as far back as 9000 BC. We have Palestinian agricultural practices that were first documented by the Natufians, which were like the first peoples there many, many years ago in that 9000 BC era. So again, I've already stressed this, but like when we talk about Palestine, we're not talking about a nation state. We're talking about currently what is defined as a set of land between certain borders from a river and from to a sea. However, ultimately, when we think about this cause, when we think about what it means to be Palestinian, when we think about liberation for Palestinians, what we're thinking about is how do we create a space for all peoples within this region, more broadly, globally, to be safe and free and have the self-determination to live the way that all of us should be allowed to live. So, As Flossy mentioned, there is a lot in terms of the ways in which Palestinians have been exiled, even within our own homes. But to get to that point, we have to understand how we were in this position. So for many years, are y'all familiar with the Ottoman Empire? So the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans, they were in rule of Palestine following some wars from roughly the year 1516 for about 400 years. And so in those 400 years, there was a lot of culture taking place. There were some Jewish folks, some Palestinian folks, some Christian folks, a lot of different entities living within that Palestinian space. And for better or worse, coexisted as well as any space with multiple different identities and peoples can exist. There were ups, there were downs. That's just how culture and movement works, especially when people have different, views of what a space is. And so over time, eventually the Ottoman Empire came to a fall, and in its wake, the British Empire basically came into Palestine in, I believe, 1917 and kind of made it a mandate by 1922. And so we find that Palestine is now this land in the 1900s in this modern day age, or as close to modern day as possible, where it's technically under British colonial rule, right? So it goes from being a part of the Ottoman Empire to being taken by the British, who then make it a mandate and under their jurisdiction of land. And we know the British, they love colonizing things. And so as Palestinians being indigenous to the land, those people who were Palestinian never stopped being Palestinian. They never became British. They just happened to be Palestinians on land that Britain said it owned. And so what does it mean to own land and to own a state? I don't really care. I don't think it's that relevant, but it becomes relevant because of a lot of movements happening behind the scenes. And particularly the movement is convened in the Swiss city of Basel in 1897. It is when the first Zionist Congress is created, and it includes over 200 delegates from all over Europe. And basically the program called for the establishing of a Jewish state in Palestine, right? Palestine had been a space that religiously for a lot of Jewish people was seen as a holy land. It was seen as a land that was entitled to the Jewish people. And so you had certain folks who, like, as Jewish folks, just wanted to live in Palestine and coexist. But then you had a subset of Jewish people who saw Palestine as land that was inherently given to them through religious decree. And as we know, y'all, like, a lot of people say things like religion is the reason they do a thing, but it's not entirely, right? We see a lot of ways in which maybe religion may be one of the arguments by which somebody takes on an action, but there's always much more economic decisions at hand. And so, for example, when we think about the Zionist Party, it's not necessarily rooted in trying to find a safe space. So one of the talking points you'll hear is the Zionist Israel needs to exist because otherwise the Jewish people would not have a safe place to live. But that negates the ways in which most countries should exist, which is people should always be safe no matter who they are. And the reaction to a lack of safety is not to expel people from a land and make it available for you to feel safe, because ultimately by doing so, you actually make that land unsafe. You remove the stewards from that land, and you actually create instability and more strife for the people you claim to be wanting to save. And so in a lot of ways, especially following and there are so many things I should tell you, but especially following these, I'm sorry, I got the time warning and I slipped a little bit. But when we think about creating space that is safe for people, it should be safe for all peoples that inhabit that space. And currently what we're finding in Palestine is a group of people who are indigenous to the land being pushed out by a group of folks who believe that the land should be theirs. Some of them may be indigenous, some of them we have a lot of evidence to believe are not. I'm not here to talk about that. I don't really care about that much. Ultimately, I believe all people should be able to live in land freely, but if they are stewards of the land and if they're stewards of the space for the stewards of the land who came before them. And so ultimately, I can get into the geopolitics of it all, but basically, in 1948, the Zionist movement gains traction in 1917. There was like the Balfour Declaration by the British that were saying like, yes, the Jewish people should have land. Oh, we happen to own Palestine. we'll give it to y'all. And so a lot of Zionist settlements were being developed in Palestine, essentially creating a proto-state within the state of the Palestine Mandate. Over time, you would see expansion of these settlements throughout Palestine until 1948, where following the Second World War, this bolstering of the case for needing a safe space for the Jewish people became far more relevant because of what happened with the Holocaust. And so basically leveraging the pain and trauma of the Holocaust, the Zionist party said, we must have our own state and you must give us Palestine. And so as a result, the British essentially supported and aided in the violent expulsion of Palestinians in order to make space for the Israeli state so that the Jewish people could live there. Now, it's important to note, the Jewish people are persecuted peoples. However, the creation of Israel, again, like we said, is not done out of safety for people. The British did not make Palestine a land for Jewish people to live in and make and actively support the Israeli state because they wanted to give the Jewish people a safe space. Europe is still intensely anti-Jewish. It was intensely anti-Semitic. Part of the reason of moving the Jewish people to Palestine is because they wanted to get rid of the Jewish people in their own lands. And so what you're seeing is an expulsion where the genocide did not kill people through the Holocaust. They're like, okay, let's move you all to this land and not have to deal with you. But also in the same respect, the Zionists politically made agreements with the British to be able to create this center within the Middle East that was inhabited by many European Jews, so that way they could also serve as a sort of partner to the Europeans they had been growing up with and alongside. So Palestine becomes this kind of hub by which the Middle East is disrupted by having European presence within it, but also giving the Jewish people a place to live and act freely. And so when we think about today, right, so 1948, what happens is Palestinians are expelled from their villages in a mass expulsion. Hundreds of villages are destroyed, thousands of Palestinians are displaced, tons of us are killed. And in doing so, that creates the space for what is Zionism, for what is Israel at the time. And then over time, settlements continue to expand through a series of wars, aggressions, etc. over time. And again, I am technically over time for what I'm supposed to be saying, but at the end of the day, currently what we find is the U.S. has been one of the largest backers of the Israeli occupation. We often don't really acknowledge Israel, not because we don't believe that states should exist, but we don't believe that land that is seized in such a violent way should ever come to be. It is technically the Zionist project. Israel doesn't exist for the Jewish people as it claims to. It uses the fear and trauma for the Jewish people as a political pawn by which to exist and expel other people who also have a right to the land. You will see a lot of different political points from Zionists that say things like it's a land without people for a people without land, ignoring the fact that Palestinians have been there for thousands of years. There's also this talking point of there's no such thing as a Palestinian. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the talk is we're just Arabs who happen to move to Palestine, and without really acknowledging that so many people who have come to Palestine are either born there and grew up there and are like have ancestors in the land, or have come from other lands to be part of these ancestral lands and have ingratiated themselves within the community. So you have, for example, African Palestinians, Indian Palestinians, Palestinians that came from Armenia, but also still, again, the indigenous Palestinians that already existed there. And so ultimately, there's a lot of Zionist talking points, a lot of violence to be navigating, but at the end of the day, it's important to be mindful of the fact that Palestine and the ways in which the current socio-political construct exists is the U.S. uses Israel as one of its bases within the Middle East and leverages the Jewish people as a kind of wedge against Arabs and the Levant and the Maghreb in order to basically create destabilization, because what is in the Middle East is oil. It is resources. It is another conglomeration of power. And what better way to disrupt power of a force that may be challenging you to politically than to embed a partner within the region that one now becomes your shield against any kind of critique. So for example, as we see the current genocide happening in Gaza, the US is technically not responsible for the genocide because the US is not actively sending its troops there, but it's proxying a genocide through Israel and kind of saying, well, it's not us doing this, it's them doing this, but then still funding the genocide itself. And so that is kind of where we find ourselves. There are so many Jewish comrades and so many Jewish people who are understanding of the fact that Israel is using their name, using their trauma as a talking point to exist in that space as an ethnocentric country. And ultimately, what Palestinians are advocating for and working for and fighting for alongside so many indigenous brothers and sisters and kin globally is a free land for all people so we can all live in harmony the way that I'm sure we can. Because honestly, when you are a steward of the land and the land is a steward of you, you know how to take care of it and be taken care of by it. And ultimately, I rambled quite a bit. I hope that was enough in 20 minutes. I've tried to fit 9,000 years into like 15 minutes, but plenty of questions to talk about. I brought up the olive trees earlier, and I wanted to say this. One thing to know about land and to know about people is if you ever have a concern about who is indigenous to the land, you must ask yourself who is taking care of it and who is willing to destroy it. And so what we're seeing today, to this point in time, in 2023, the people who are dying next to the olive trees, the people who are trying their best to save the olive trees are Palestinians. Whereas we're seeing Israeli occupation forces actively go into Palestine, actively going into these farms and destroying them, burning them, basically trying to create a situation where, one, our identity is being stripped of us, the thing that we love so dearly is being ripped from us and being disrupted. But three, like, the goal is to basically destroy Palestine as it is and make an entirely different state there in our stead, on our graves, and we can't stand for that. So thank you all, and we'll have questions. Free Palestine.
I think it's important to note that the same oppression that Palestinians are facing via Israel is the same actors that have committed a lot of genocides back home to indigenous peoples. And when I say indigenous peoples of Latin America, Israel has also been a major factor of the Pinochet dictatorship, which built concentration camps in Chile and killed a lot of people over there too. It has also been a major factor in supplying weapons and trainings for the Guatemalan government to kill 200,000 indigenous Mayans. And it also has been one of the people who has sponsored trainings and weapons to my homelands of El Salvador via death squads that killed over 30,000 indigenous peoples in my homelands. So when I say solidarity amongst indigenous peoples, our own communities are not going to save us anymore. Like, we really have to look on a global indigenous level. Tariq needs to be able to call me, to call Messiah, to call Kiauri, to call Serum, and be like, I need your indigenous communities to come to Palestine to help us free this land. And we also need to be able to do that with his communities back home too. And that's not going to happen until there is a relationship and an understanding on what's happening on indigenous lands globally. Because at the end of the day, like, we're not here to negotiate with white people anymore. We're not here to negotiate with global leaders. We already know they don't care about us. At this point, we are here to build relationships and solidarity amongst indigenous people. And what does that mean to really protect each other's lands? Because what's happening in Palestine has already happened to a lot of us. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's gonna happen to you. And you're gonna want all of us to really be in solidarity and throw hands when it's time to throw hands, because it's not a joke anymore. And it never has been. It's not a situation where we can keep talking about it, we can keep doing workshops about it. Like, no, how are we literally forming solidarity in action? I'm done with the theory. It's been a long time done with the theory. I'm not doing this anymore. Like, we really need to organize these groups now and figure out how each representative from each indigenous community is pulling up to Palestine to free Palestine. Because the time is up.
So add to that, and what Felicity's saying is like, y'all, one of the things about like this movement and like when you talk about like wanting folks to come to Palestine, y'all can't get in, right? Like Felicity already talked about how trying to get in, you are policed, you are met with disgust, you are met with like questions and just this entire idea of like you shouldn't be here. Similarly, we can't really leave. I'm from Gaza specifically. Gaza is an open air prison, a lot of people say, but prison implies that you are a prisoner. It's a concentration camp. We're hostages. And so a lot of people don't realize that like part of the ways in which our communities have been under attack is because they have sectioned us off from each other, right? I can't build power with folks in the Amazon or anywhere else because I can barely build power at my house. I can barely build power in Gaza. I myself, as a Palestinian from Gaza, have not been able to go back to Gaza in roughly 16, 17 years, whereas I used to go every couple of years. There has been a siege on Gaza for since 2005, right? Or 2004, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's roughly 20 years of siege in which there's a blockade that prevents certain goods from getting in, exports from getting out. And so what does it mean to be a Palestinian? And when we think about like the genocide happening, it was either we die from the slow death of the crippling effects on our economy, our ability to connect with people outside of our space, or we die from a bomb. Because every couple years, the Israeli occupation forces decide they want to do this thing where they call it mowing the lawn, where they kill us off, make sure there's less of us. And for them, they were nothing, like they were ecstatic to have an opportunity to leverage more propaganda to kill all of us today. That's why you're seeing roughly 20,000 people have been killed so far just in the span of a couple of months. And so when I think about Palestine and I think about showing up, I understand that sometimes people in that might not know how to or why to, but no matter what, whether we've shown up for each other yet or not as publicly as people might think, there's always been solidarity across the space. This is an opportunity because, as Felicity mentioned, so much of what's happening to us in Palestine has been happening globally for generations. When I think about Palestine, I don't care about it just as a Palestinian. I think about it as an organizer, as a person who's a steward of this world, where if we're able to stop a genocide and to turn back the tide on occupation in Palestine in 2023, it offers us a blueprint by how to do that for all of our indigenous communities across the world. And so that's why I advocate for a free Palestine and a liberated Palestine. Not just because I'm Palestinian, but because I'm hoping that it becomes the blueprint by which we liberate ourselves and create a framework across the world. So with that, do people have questions? Yes.
What are your suggestions for our relatives in the global south for solidarity actions? I know that we talked about disruption. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think like ultimately just to touch back on what Florcy and Thorek have shared around solidarity, the best thing that we can do in terms of actions is actually speaking with our community, like our loved ones within our villages, about what's happening globally and how we want to connect, and just showing, I think that there's just like really beautiful imagery also, like just to show that Palestinians, that like all of us all over the world within our communities deep in the jungle and elsewhere deep in the Arctic as well are here, seeing them, witnessing them, and that when we find the pathways to show up and throw down, that we're ready. And I think that that's really the best thing that we can do right now is just be vocal.
I guess the other thing I could add is it's levels, right? So if your community doesn't have like a basic understanding of the cause, I think the first level is just education, awareness, just doing that, as Messiah mentioned, like talk to families. But if you're in a community where it's like, no, we know what it is, we know what maybe we don't know all the clear points, but we know enough to be able to act. Then maybe the next step is doing some protests. Maybe it's some more teach-ins. Maybe it's talking to whoever like the local community leaders are to make sure that they're also advocating and speaking on behalf of us as people more effectively. It really just depends on the space you're in. And also, I think the biggest thing for us is like, for me, I'm in the U.S., Turtle Island, and so I live in National Land, and ultimately, the people I have to go and address are some elected officials who are willing to like co-sign this. And so my thing is disrupt them. Make sure they hear us, make sure they see us. But also, I'm not trying to wait for the next election for them to do stuff. I want to disrupt business as usual. And so if I know, for example, that there is a weapons manufacturer in my location, I'm going to go make sure that weapons manufacturer can't be making weapons anymore, right? I think more globally, I think about things like the stock market. Why are weapons companies, one, allowed to exist, but two, why are they on the stock market to be traded? Things like that, I think if all of us as people can come together and find ways to disrupt is a great tactic. It just depends on where you are.
Yeah, one of the points I want to share is that for many of us that had been involved with all those years, like close to 20 years of this working group of Native Indigenous peoples in Geneva, writing the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It was back in the late 80s and right into the 90s that Palestine, we have a relationship of solidarity with old school American Indian movement, a lot of our indigenous groups that were in Geneva. They would back us up in the full plenary with all the countries. They would defend our rights of indigenous peoples with the S. At that time, the system, the World Bank, countries did not want to recognize us with the S, peoples collectively. So we fought a long time, but Palestine, we remember that. So there was an agreement of solidarity with the old school folks. You know, some of them passed on, Russell Means and many others. So, but we remember that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the last closing remark, and to speak on what our elder is saying is, a lot of times people will say things like, and they say this for all of us, the old will die and the young will forget, but the old haven't died and the young are still here and learning and becoming the elders that we learned from. So it's up to us to keep the fight going. And at some point, we will have a free Palestine within our lifetimes and a free world for all indigenous peoples everywhere across the world. Thank you all.
So just a quick announcement. We're going to rally up out here in about 10 minutes on the front of the building for a Palestinian Solidarity Action. So if you want to join us, we'll be downstairs.